Uncle Ron and Stuff, episode 15. And today's subject is the Lennox HVAC, which I think stands for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. I have a Lennox system. Overall, I'm impressed with Lennox design and implementation. The best example I can give you of that is in the compressor unit outside, they have two uh, run capacitors instead of a single dual, which is what you normally find in a compressor unit. You need a run capacitor for the compressor, and you need a run capacitor for the fan that sucks air into the coils and cools down the coils. Anyway, they have two, not just one dual. And capacitors, especially in the condenser unit, are the weakest point of the system. They fail all the time. And in fact, if you talk to an HVAC repairman, they make their living on replacing those run capacitors because, especially in the summer, they get so hot they fail. Anyway, I moved into this house from an older house that had baseboard hot water heat and a single zone air conditioning system. This home has three zones and uh, uses a natural gas furnace. I wasn't familiar with a natural gas furnace. Anyway, I wasn't here very long before I realized that uh, although I have three thermostats, one for each zone, that every time I turned the AC on, it was blowing air in all zones. Okay, something's not right. I didn't want to learn it, so I sort of had to. Anyway, the main points I want to make about the Linux system is one, the control board, and two, the temperature probe. Uh, in a multi zone system, you'll have multiple thermostats. And in a single zone system, the thermostat connects directly to the outside compressor, and it's what turns the compressor on. Well, if you had three zones, you can't do it that way. You have to use what's called a control board, and the thermostats all tie to the control board, and then the control board turns on the compressor or not. Same way with heat. Okay, so you've got a control board, and Linux makes a control board. Uh, they also have a temperature probe that sticks into the ductwork. Now, what you find is most HVAC technicians do not understand or know about the Linux control board or the functions of the temperature probe. In most systems, there is in a forced air system, there is a temperature probe, and what it primarily does on most systems is if the air gets too cold, it shuts down the compressor so it can't damage itself or the coils will freeze over. That's what happens, and then you get no air through. Most do have a temperature probe for that function only. It's just to detect the air is so cold or approaching freezing. In Linux, that's not the case. In most zone systems, you have to have a control board. Honeywell is a normal control board used. In fact, at one time when I was struggling with it, I called a Linux supplier and had his technician come out. He surveyed the system. I said, this is what's not functioning right. He said, okay, well, replace the control board that you have, which is Linux, with a Honeywell board. And I said, well, why would you do that? You're a Linux dealer. And they said, we don't install Linux control boards. And I now know why that's the case. Anyway, the main points are that temperature probe that's in the ductwork, uh, it served the Linux control board uses it for staging. It's not only senses the temperature of the air and the AC condition. This says, okay, shut down the compressor because the air is getting too cold and the coils are going to freeze over. No, it also stages. Now, what does staging mean? My compressor outside is what's known as a two-stage compressor. In a normal condition, it's rated at 3 tons, but if 3 tons can't properly cool the house, the Linux control board will tell it to go to 5 tons, and that is supposed to get the air cool enough to keep the temperature from rising in the home. Okay, the temperature probe is what the Linux control board uses to do the staging. I also have a two-stage furnace, but as far as I can tell, it normally runs always at the second stage. But in the Linux system, the control board stages the AC via that probe. That's what most HVAC people do not understand, that the staging is done by that. Now, the Linux control board is different than the Honeywell board in that you can set the airflow that you want by zones. Uh, in my house on the main floor, there are 2 zones, one for the main kitchen, dining room, so on. And then there's a separate zone for the master bedroom. So I have 2 thermostats on that floor. And then I have a large room over the garage known as a frog or free room over garage. It has its own thermostat. All thermostats get tied to the Linux control board. Okay. As they call for heat or cool, the board recognizes, okay, this particular zone has called for that. So it closes the uh, valves that are in the ductwork going to zones that don't want or need AC or heat, leaves the zone open that is calling for heat, and that's the way the control valves work in the ductwork. They're normally open, and if they're not going to be needed, they close. That's what the control board also does that. It opens or closes the valves in the ductwork by zone. Okay. I think that's pretty much done on any zone control board, Honeywell or anybody else. But that's part of the function of the control board. The real aspect is that temperature probe, especially on AC. Uh, Again, the temperature probe monitors the temperature of the air coming in the ductwork. Okay, so if the air coming out in AC, the thermostat is calling again for a certain, wants more AC. And if the temperature doesn't drop enough in the ductwork at stage 1, then it triggers the compressor to go to stage 2. Now, in normal single stage system, again, the thermostat's wired directly to the compressor, so uh, there's no staging involved. In this case, the wires for the compressor, the AC compressor, are controlled by the Linux control board. Again, it's a zone system, so you can't just tie a thermostat directly to the compressor. Okay, so if the temperature probe, that's when the control board will turn on a relay that says go to stage 2. Again, HVAC technicians know minimal about the Linux control board or that temperature probe. The other thing about the Lennox control board is you can set the amount of airflow that you want out of the blower. I have a variable speed blower, so I can control the RPM of that blower from, I think the minimum is 400 or 500 revolutions per minute, up all the way up to 1700 or 1900 revolutions per minute. I think it's normally rated in cubic feet per minute. Uh, I think if in my particular furnace or uh, blower unit, which is in the attic, there's a small window that you can look into, and you'll find a flashing light, and that flashing light beeps for uh, cubic feet per minute, and you have to wait and find what starts its cycle again, but you can count the number that cubic feet per minute of airflow you're getting. Okay. So when the systems are installed by HVAC people, they set the airflow by zone to some sort of default. Let's say 100%, 50%, 60%, I don't know. The idea being that if it's too powerful, you'll hear noise coming out. It's wind coming out of your ductwork, and some people don't like that; it's too noisy, so they turn it down. And each zone can be at a different setting. Now, with Lennox and I suspect with Honeywell, if two zones are calling at the same time, they basically sum whatever those settings are set to, and you quickly get to 100% anyway. Honeywell has a way of changing the amount of air per zone. uh, but anyway, the Lennox board, because of its staging and because you can set the amount of airflow per zone, you can also change the airflow for heat as opposed to AC. Okay, all that means is when it's initially set up, it's probably not right because the settings will be or can be and are unique to your particular home configuration uh, and how they initially designed the zones, what parts or rooms of your home were decided to be in a separate zone. Here, I don't have a problem. The main floor zone, yeah, of course. The zone over the garage, yeah, of course. I don't normally have that zone on because there's nobody up there. Okay. The zone in the bedroom is a problem for me. It's a relatively small space. I like the idea that it's separately zoned because I don't have to heat it and cool it during the day. There's a door on it. However, it is so small that what I find is that no matter what I set the amount of airflow for that particular zone, the temperature probe likes to say that the coils are freezing over and that it shuts the system down. Now, I've played around with various settings. Even if I set 100%, I want all of the fan blowing into the single zone when it's calling for it and nothing else is. I can still get a coil freezing indication on my control board. This was a design problem when they installed the system to start with. That zone is just too small. And the other factor is that the return on that particular zone is the shortest return of all three returns I have. You have one return for each zone going into the blower unit in the attic, and the return from the smallest zone is the shortest zone. Well, air takes the path of least resistance. So when the blower is going, it's trying to suck most of the air out of the smallest zone. Now, yeah, the main floor has the largest return duct, and it's always open. In fact, in a normal system, all returns are normally open. There's no valving on those. The idea is the blower needs all the air it can get. I take a different I have different thoughts about that. I don't think I need to be pulling in cold air from a zone that I'm not currently heating. So I have installed control valves in the returns on two of the three zones. The main zone is always open, and you want that. But for like the small bedroom, why should I be pulling cold air or hot air out of that zone when it's nobody in there? I don't need it. Same way with the zone over the frog. Uh, it's not normally used, so I don't care if it gets hot and I don't care if it gets too cold. It's not going to freeze. So anyway, I have control valves in those two returns. So if they're not being used, air is not being sucked out of those things. Now, yeah, again, an insulation issue. In this particular case for Lennox, the main return is on the motor side of the blower unit. It's got a motor in a way. There's a big squirrel cage fan up there. On the open side of the fan is where I have the small zone directly feeding into it. So it really should have been the other way. The main return should have been directly into the open end of the squirrel cage, but that's not the case. I don't have a good fix for that. I do have a control valve on the small return line, and what I've found is that it works sort of that way, but I wound up putting in an adjustable control valve as well. So uh, when that uh, uh, zone calls for cooling, not only does the zone control valve installed in return open up, but also have another control valve that's fixed that somewhat moderates the amount of air that can be pulled in. I had to do that because no matter what I did, I could get frozen coil indication on the small zone when it called by itself, even with the main return vent open. Anyway, the point being is the Linux control board, they don't want to install them because whatever the initial settings are, that they, when it's all set up and operation, yep, it works. They walk away. Well, the customer will call a week, month later and say, hey, it's not right. I'm too hot in one zone, too cold in another, so they have to come back. And then it happens again and again. That's the reason they don't like installing Linux control boards. So, if you have a Linux system, first of all, realize, and it's a zone system, realize that that temperature probe does more than just checks that the coils are not freezing. It actually used the Linux control board uses it to stage equipment. The second point is the Linux control board is a mystery to most HVAC techs. They understand the idea of zoning, and they understand the thermostats are coming to it, and they understand that it's controlling the valves that are placed in the outlet of each zone off the blower. They understand that part fine. They do not understand the staging aspect of it, and they also don't, well, they understand, but they don't like it, setting the percentages of flow that you can get per zone, okay? Also, that you can set and lower blower speed for the heat or increase it for AC. All those are adjustable. Those things are not necessarily completely adjustable on a Honeywell board. So if they have a problem with the Linux board, they're going to say, well, you need a whole new control board, and Honeywell is great. The Honeywell board doesn't do the staging like the Linux board does. It doesn't have as much flexibility in controlling things. I'm not sure the flexibility really helps a whole lot because, again, when two zones are calling, the total RPMs of the blower is going to be the sum of whatever is set to for those two zones, and it's probably 100% anyway. So you have limited additional capabilities with the Linux board. Whether they're worth the hassle, I'm not sure. If the temperature probe goes bad, the Linux control board automatically faults to the master thermostat controlling the whole system. And the master is zone 1, which is usually the main house. Okay, I've sort of covered the main points. Uh, the Linux multi-zone control system has, or probably has in your case, a Linux control board. There was a what's called a Harmony 2 board. That was the original board that Linux supplied with their systems back in whatever. And then they updated it to a Linux 3 control board. And then they finally came out with a Wi-Fi enabled control board is what they're currently selling. They still sell the Linux Harmony 2 and then the Harmony I series or whatever it's called. You may have either a Linux Control Harmony 2 or a Harmony 3 or a web-based enabled Harmony E series. The Linux Control Board 1, it's entirely different layout than the Linux Control Board 3. I swapped out my old Linux Control Board 2 for a Linux Control Board 3, and I did it myself, but all the wiring is different. So I had to cut drywall out to be able to get to all of the lines, the thermostat lines as well as the zone control valve lines, to be able to rewire for the Harmony 3. Anyway, that pretty much covers, and again, I repeat the main points. Most HVAC techs do not understand the Linux control board in a multi-zone system. They do not understand the temperature probe is doing more than just detecting frozen coils. So, they'll come in and if it's not working right, they'll say you need a new zone controller. Replace your Harmony with whatever it is, when it may be simply the temperature probe gone bad. I had trouble finding a temperature probe. I didn't realize, and it probably is a 10K ohm sensor, and you can buy those things. Linux didn't. They didn't offer it anymore, and they wouldn't give me any specifications on what ohmage it was. It could be a 10K or 100K. I suspect it's a normal 10K, and you can find those in a configuration that will go and fit in your Linux system if you do it yourself. The probe that goes in the Linux system actually is held in a mounting clamp, so you can pull out the probe without removing the mounting clamp and put a new probe in it. Enough of that. If you have a Linux system, the control board can be a problem because HVAC techs don't understand it. So it's up to you, if you will, to learn as much as you can. There are manuals about it, it explains it, it gets really technical, but the main point is if you wanted to do it yourself, you can take the cover off and change the blower speeds for each zone. Now, usually you shut down the power for the board before you do that, and in my case, the switch for that was next to the blower unit. I won't get into the power, how things get powered, but to say that control circuits and things like this are always 24 volts AC. That means there's some transformer someplace. 2 in the Linux system, usually in the blower unit. That's enough for today. I have a website where I write about these things, www.ronstoltz.com, and shared knowledge. I am going to try over the winter to put up some articles about the Linux system, but I wanted to at least compare to you at this point about the control board and the temperature system and lack of general knowledge of the Linux systems by HVAC techs, and even Linux people don't like installing the Linux control board because it means multiple callbacks to get it set correctly. That's enough today. I handled the Linux system. By the way, the system I have is known as a signature system. I think it's a higher end of what Linux provides. This is really long. Hopefully somebody's got a Linux system besides me. And they probably don't understand much about it, and they're finding that the techs don't understand much about it. You do not have to swap out your control board unless it's really defective, and I know if you don't know enough, you're not going to know that. But usually it's because the techs don't understand it enough, and they don't want to learn it. That's enough for today. Uncle Ron and stuff. This is episode 15, and it's the 16th of December, 2022 already.